Hello friends, welcome back to my YouTube channel Journey with Vijay Kumar Shrivastav. Today I am going to present the topic Great Famines of the World. Before presentation I would like to introduce myself. I am Vijay Kumar Shrivastav. I have completed M.Sc Agriculture with a specialization in Agronomy from Pant University of Agriculture and Technology Pantnagar in 1996. So let's proceed to the presentation. First, to understand famine. A famine is a widespread scarcity of food caused by several factors including war, inflation, crop failure, population imbalance, or government policies. This phenomenon is usually accompanied or followed by regional malnutrition, starvation, epidemic, and increased mortality. A famine is an acute episode of extreme hunger that results in excess mortality due to starvation or hunger-induced diseases. It is this crisis characteristics that distinguishes it from persistent malnutrition. Term famine can mean different things to different people and has evolved over time. It is only in recent years that more precise, measurable definitions in terms of mortality rates, food consumption, and physical signs of malnutrition have been developed. Here to study the linkage between war, famine, and disease. Whether children are on their own or with their parents, most of the children who die in wartime have not been hit by bombs or bullets but have succumbed to starvation or sickness. In African wars, lack of food and medical services combined with the stress of flight have killed about 20 times more people than have armaments. One 1980 study in a war zone in Uganda attributed only 2% of the deaths to violence, whereas 20% were caused by disease and 78% by hunger. And when war is combined with drought, the death toll can be enormous. In Somalia during 1992, half or more of all the children under 5 age on 1st January were dead by 31st December, and around 90% of these died from the interaction of malnutrition and diseases. Most such deaths arise from disruption of the normal production and distribution of food. The manipulation of food supplies has always been a significant tactic of war, but has been used particularly ruthlessly of late. For example, in early 1980s, the Ethiopian government used a scorched earth tactics to destroy hundreds of thousands of acres of food producing land in Tigray. And in Angola, the UNITA forces sowed large areas of land with anti-personnel mines to hamper food production in government-controlled areas, while mobilizing and relocating its own supporters to create food production bases. In many countries, grain stores have also been subject to attack by rebel and government forces. So these all will lead to the famine. War also hinders the distribution of food relief. Governments often feed their armies first, distributing to the civilian population only the food that remains. In Somalia in the 1980s, one estimate suggested that only 12% of some food aid shipment reached the people for whom they were intended. Not only does war interrupt the distribution of food, but it also cuts supplies of water with particular risks in cities. The long and devastating war in Lebanon had a very damaging effect on the quantity and quality of drinking water. One 1990 study found that 66% of urban water sources were contaminated, and that one-third of urban communities were using cesspools for sewage disposal. Water can also be a weapon of war. In Sarajevo, water systems have deliberately been destroyed to isolate and break down residential neighborhoods. During the course of the war, 30% of the pumping system and 60% of the water mains piping has been ruined. Now we will study about various great famines. First one is the Great Irish Famine, which is also called Irish Potato Famine. In Irish language, it is termed as Holodomor, which means great hunger. It was a period of mass starvation and disease in Ireland from 1845 to 1849, with the most severely affected areas in the west and south of Ireland. The period was contemporaneously known in Irish as an Dosal, loosely translated as hard times or literally the bad life. The worst year of the period was 1847, which is known as Black 47. During the famine, about 1 million people died and a million more immigrated, causing Ireland's population to fall by between 20 to 25%. Famine that occurred in Ireland in 1845 to 49 when the potato crop failed in successive years. The crop failures were caused by late blight of potato, a disease that destroys both the leaves and edible roots or tubers of the potato plant. The causative agent of late blight is the water mold Phytophthora infestans. The Irish famine was the worst to occur in Europe in the 19th century. The proximate cause of the famine was a natural event, a late blight of potato disease which infected potato crops throughout Europe during the 1840s, also causing some 1 lakh deaths outside Ireland and influencing much of the unrest in the widespread European revolutions of 1848. From 1846, the impact of the blight was exacerbated by the Whig government's economic policy of laissez-faire capitalism. Longer-term causes include the system of absentee landlordism and single crop dependence. In 1851, the census of Ireland commissioners recorded 24 failures of the potato crop going back to 1728 of varying severity. General crop failures through disease or frost were recorded in 1739, 1740, 1770, 1800 and 1807. According to Woodham Smith, the unreliability of the potato crop was an accepted fact in Ireland. Second is Bengal famine of 1943. The Bengal famine of 1943 was a famine in the Bengal province of British India, now Bangladesh and Eastern India, during World War II. An estimated 2.1 to 3 million population out of a population of 60.3 million died of starvation, malaria or other diseases aggravated by malnutrition, population displacement, unsanitary conditions and lack of health care. Millions were impoverished as the crisis overwhelmed large segments of the economy and catastrophically disrupted the social fabric. Eventually, families disintegrated, men sold their small farms and left home to look for work or to join the British Indian Army, and women and children became homeless migrants, often traveling to Calcutta or other large cities in search of organized relief. Cochleobolus meibianus, formerly known as Helminthosporium oryzae, is a fungus that causes brown spot disease in rice. This disease was the causal agent of the Bengal famine of 1943. Is an important plant pathogen because it causes a common and widespread disease that causes high level of crop yield losses. It was a major cause of the Bengal famine of 1943, where the crop yield was dropped by 40% to 90% and death of 2 million people was recorded. It is a possible agro-terrorism weapon. Other known severe crop loss cases caused by Cochleobolus meibianus are globally distributed. In the Philippines, rice seedling mortality rate records up to 60%. In India and Nigeria, it can reduce crop yield up to 40%. Similar losses are observed in Suriname and Sumatra. Bengal's economy had been predominantly agrarian, with between half and 3/4 of rural poor subsisting in a semi-starved condition. Stagnant agriculture productivity and a stable land base were unable to cope up with a rapidly increasing population. resulting in both long-term decline in per capita availability of rice and growing numbers of the land poor and landless laborers. A high proportion labored beneath a chronic and spiraling cycle of debt and ended in debt bondage and the loss of their land holding due to land grabbing. The Government of India's Famine Inquiry Commission report 1945 described Bengal as a land of rice growers and rice eaters. Rice dominated the agriculture output of the province, accounting for nearly 88% of its arable land use and 75% of its crops. Overall, Bengal produced one-third of India's rice, more than any other single province. Rice accounted for 75 to 85% of daily food consumption, with fish and second major food source supplemented by small amounts of wheat. Historians usually characterize the famine as anthropogenic, which is man-made, asserting that wartime colonial policies created and then exacerbated the crisis. Third famine is the Great Bengal Famine of 1770. The famine occurred between 1769 to 1773. In Bengali calendar, it is the period from 1176 to 1180 that affected the lower Gangetic plain of British India from Bihar to the Bengal region. The famine is estimated to have caused the deaths of about 10 million people, and Warren Hastings' 1772 report estimated that a third of the population in the affected region starved to death. Rajat Datta, which economist estimates a much lower revised number, in the range of about 2 million dead within 6 to 7 months, claiming that the 10 million figure carries little conviction. The famine is one of the many famines and famine-triggered epidemics that devastated the Indian subcontinent during the 18th and 19th century. It is usually attributed to a combination of weather and the policies of the British East India Company. A partial shortfall in crops considered nothing out of the ordinary occurred in 1768 and was followed in late 1769 by much more severe conditions. By September 1769, after the failure of the annual south-east monsoon, there was a severe drought and alarming reports were coming into rural distress. The start of the famine has been attributed to a failed monsoon in 1769 that caused widespread drought and 2 consecutive failed rice crops. These were, however, largely ignored by the company officers. By early 1770, there was starvation, and by mid 1770, deaths from starvation were occurring on a large scale. Nobel Prize winning Indian economist Amartya Sen describes it as a man-made famine, noting that no previous famine had occurred in Bengal that century, and the region under the Muslim rule was one of the world's major economic power and signaled the proto-industrialization. Historian William Dalrymple held that the deindustrialization of Bengal and the British policies were the reasons for the mass famine and widespread atrocities. The Bengali name Chihotarar Monontor is derived from Bengali calendar year 1176, and the word for famine is taken from there, where Chihattar means 76 and Monontor means famine. So in Bengali it is called famine in 1976. As a result of famine, large areas were depopulated and returned to jungle for decades to come as the survivor migrated in search of food. Many cultivated lands were abandoned. Much of Birbhum, for instance, returned to jungle and was virtually impassable for decades afterwards. From 1772 onwards, bands of bandits and thugs became an established feature of Bengal and were only brought under control by punitive actions in the 1790s. The devastation from war and exploitative tax revenue maximization policies of the rapacious British East India Company after 1765 crippled the economic resources of the rural population. Now, fourth famine is the Bangladesh famine of 1974. It refers to a period of mass starvation beginning in March 1974 and ending in about December 1974. The famine is considered the worst in recent decades, and it was characterized by massive flooding along the Brahmaputra River as well as high mortality. In terms of mortality, though figures vary, one scholar estimates 1.5 million deaths as a reasonable estimate. This number includes the post-famine mortality. Starvation was not the only factor. A significant number of deaths are attributable to cholera, malaria, and diarrheic diseases. As with most famines, weakened disease-susceptible conditions resulted in high post-famine mortalities of over 450,000. The poor laborers and non-landowners were especially susceptible. Multiple authors agree that wage labor suffered the highest mortality for all groups. Crude death rate among landless families was 3 times higher than that for families with 3 or more acres land. Now to study the causes of Bangladesh famine. As with most famines, the causes of the Bangladesh famine were multiple, which includes first one flooding, second rapid population growth, third government mismanagement of food grain stocks, and fourth legislation restricting movement of food grains between districts, and fifth food grain smuggling to neighboring countries and so-called distributional failures. The famine didn't occur among all areas and population but was concentrated in specific areas, particularly those hit by flooding. In their studies of 1974 famine, various scholars find that 1974 average food grain production was a local peak. For this reason, scholars argue that food availability approach offers very little in the way of explanation of the Bangladesh famine of 1974. Rather, they argue that the Bangladesh famine was not caused by a failure in availability of food, but its distribution, where one group gained market command over food. There were two distributional failures stand out. First failure was internal, where the specific configuration of the state rationing system and the market resulted in speculative hoarding by farmers and traders and a consequent rise in prices. The second failure was external factor. The US had withheld 2.2 million tons of food aid, as the then US ambassador to Bangladesh made it abundantly clear that the US probably could not commit food aid because of Bangladesh's policy of exporting jute to Cuba. And by the time Bangladesh succumbed to the American pressure and stopped jute exports to Cuba, the food aid in transit was too late for famine victims. Now, fifth famine is the Doji Bara famine, which is also known as Askal famine of 1791-92. In the Indian subcontinent was brought on by a major El Nino event lasting from 1789 to 1795 and producing prolonged droughts. Recorded by William Roxburgh, a surgeon with the British East India Company, in a series of pioneering meteorological observations, the El Nino event caused the failure of the South Asian monsoon for 4 consecutive years starting in 1789. With increasing parts of India under the direct rule or indirect influence of the East India Company, the incidence of famine expanded dramatically, first under the company and then under the British Crown. In fact, British control of India started with a famine in Bengal in 1770 and ended in a famine again in Bengal in 1943. The famine of 1791-92, which was severe, caused widespread mortality in Hyderabad, southern Maratha Kingdom, Deccan, Gujarat and Marwar, where it was ruled by some Muslim emperors and some area was having the influence of East India Company. In regions like the Madras Presidency, which was governed by the East India Company, where records were kept, half the population perished in some districts, such as in the North Circles. In other areas, such as Bijapur, although no records were kept, both the famine and the year 1791 came to be known in folklore as the Doji Bara or the skull famine. On account, it was said, of the bones of the victims which lay unburied, whitening the roads and the fields. As in the Chalisa famine of a decade earlier, many areas were depopulated from death or migration. According to one study, a total of 11 million people may have died during the years 1789 to 1792 as a result of starvation or accompanying epidemics of disease. Next famine is the Orissa famine of 1866, which affected the east coast of India from Madras northwards, an area covering 1,80,000 miles and containing a population of 4,75 lakhs. The impact of the famine, however, was greatest in Orissa, which at that time was quite isolated from the rest of India. In Orissa, 1/3 of the population died due to famine. Like all Indian famines of the 19th century, the Orissa famine was preceded by drought. The population of the region depended on the rice crop of the winter season for their sustenance. However, the monsoon of 1865 was scanty and stopped prematurely. In addition, the Bengal Board of Revenue made incorrect estimates of the numbers of people who would need help and was misled by fictitious price lists. Consequently, as the food reserves began to dwindle, the gravity of the situation was not grasped until the end of May 1866, and by then the monsoon had set in. Efforts to ship the food to the isolated province were hampered because of bad weather, and when some shipments did reach the coast of Orissa, they could not be moved inland. The British Indian government imported some 10,000 tons of rice, which reached the affected population only in September. Although many people died of starvation, more were killed by cholera before the monsoons and by malaria afterwards. In Orissa alone, at least 1 million people, a third of the population, died in 1866, and overall, in the region approximately 4 to 5 million people died in the 2 years period. Next famine is the Holodomor, which is Ukrainian words derived from Moriti Holodom, which means to kill by starvation or death by hunger. This was a man-made famine in Soviet Ukraine from 1932 to 1933 that killed millions of Ukrainians. It is also known as the terror famine and famine genocide in Ukraine, and sometimes referred to as the Great Famine or Ukrainian genocide of 1932-33. It was part of the wider Soviet famine of 1932-33, which affected the major grain-producing areas of the country. During the Holodomor, millions of inhabitants of Ukraine, the majority of whom were ethnic Ukrainians, died of starvation in a peacetime catastrophe unprecedented in the history of Ukraine. Since 2006, the Holodomor has been recognized by Ukraine and 15 other countries as a genocide of the Ukrainian people carried out by the Soviet government. Early estimates of the death toll by scholars and government officials varied greatly. According to higher estimates, up to 12 million ethnic Ukrainians were said to have perished as a result of the famine. A United Nations joint statement signed by countries in 2003 declared that 7 to 10 million perished. Next famine is the North Korean famine. In Korean, it is also known as Arduous March or the March of Suffering, which was a period of mass starvation together with a general economic crisis from 1994 to 1998 in North Korea. The famine stemmed from a variety of factors. economic mismanagement and the loss of Soviet support caused food production and imports to decline rapidly. A series of floods and droughts exacerbated the crisis. The North Korean government and its centrally planned system proved too inflexible to effectively curtail the disaster. Estimates of the death toll vary widely. Out of a total population of approximately 22 million, somewhere between 240,000 to 35 lakhs North Korean died from starvation or hunger-related illness, with the deaths peaking in 1997. A 2011 US Census Bureau report estimated the number of excess deaths from 1993 to 2000 to be in between 5 lakhs to 6 lakh. Now we will study about causes of North Korean famines. Floods and distribution systems are responsible for the same. The economic decline and failed policies provided the context for the famine, but the floods of the mid-1990s were the immediate cause. The floods in July and August 1995 were described as being of biblical proportions by independent observers. They were estimated to be affected as much as 30% of the country. The major issues created by the floods were not only the destruction of croplands and harvest, but also the loss of emergency grain reserves, because many of them were stored underground. According to the United Nations, the floods of 1994 and 1995 destroyed around 1.5 million tons of grain reserves, and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention stated that 1.2 million tons or 12% of grain production was lost in the 1995 flood. There were further major floods in 1996 and a drought in 1997. There were failure of the public distribution system also. North Korea's vulnerability to the floods and famine was exacerbated by the failure of the public distribution system. The regime refused to pursue policies that would have allowed food imports and distribution without discrimination to all regimes of the country. During the famine, the urban working class of the cities and towns of the eastern provinces of the country was hit particularly hard. The distribution of flood reflected basic principles of satisfaction of the communist system. Food was distributed to people according to their political standing and their degree of loyalty to the state. Next famine is the Russian famine of 1921-22, which is also known as the Povolice famine, which was a severe famine in the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, which began early in the spring of 1921 and lasted through 1922. This famine killed an estimated 5 million people, primarily affecting the Volga and Ural river regions, and peasants resorted to cannibalism. The famine resulted from the combined effects of economic disturbance because of the Russian Revolution and Russian Civil War, exacerbated by rail systems that could not distribute food efficiently. One of Russia's intermittent drought in 1921 aggravated the situation to a national catastrophe. Hunger was so severe that it was likely seed grain would be eaten rather than sown. At one point, relief agencies had to give food to railroad staff to get their supplies moved. The United States sent food and medicines that fed about 11 million people in Soviet. Next, the Soviet famine of 1932-33, which was a major famine that killed millions of people in the major grain-producing areas of the Soviet Union, including Ukraine, Northern Caucasus, Volga region and Kazakhstan, the South Urals and West Siberia. The Holodomor in Ukraine and Kazakh famine of 1932-33 have been seen as genocide committed by Joseph Stalin's government. It has been estimated that between 3.3 and 3.9 million died in Ukraine and 2 million, which was approximately 40% of all Kazakhs, died in Kazakhstan. The major contributing factors to the famine includes the forced collectivization of agriculture as a part of the Soviet first five-year plan, forced grain procurement, grain exports by the Soviet Union at the same time, disastrous disruption of agriculture productivity, combined with rapid industrialization, a decreasing agricultural workforce, low harvest due to natural disasters combined with increased demand for food, and several bad droughts. The famine is seen by some historians as a deliberate act of genocide against ethnic Ukrainians and Kazakhs, while other critics dispute the relevance of any ethnic motivation, as is frequently implied by that term. The focus is instead on the class dynamics between land-owning peasants with a strong political interest in the private property and the ruling Communist Party fundamental tenets, which were diametrically opposed to those interests. The Finland famine of 1866-1868, which was the last famine in Finland and the last major naturally caused famine in Europe. In Finland, the famine is known as the Great Hunger Years. About 8.5% of entire population died of hunger in the hardest hit areas, up to 20%. The total death toll was 2,70,000 in 3 years, about 1,50,000 in excess of normal mortality. The worst hit areas were Satakunta, Tavastia, Ostrobothnia and North Karelia. Parts of the country had suffered poor harvest in previous years, most notably in 1862. The summer of 1866 was extremely rainy and staple crops failed widely. Potatoes and root vegetables rotted in the fields, and conditions for sowing grain in the autumn were unfavorable. When stored food ran out, thousands took to the roads to beg. The following winter was hard and spring was late. In Helsinki, the average temperature in May 1867 was 1.8 degrees centigrade, about 8 degrees centigrade below the long-time average, and by far the coldest such month in the meteorological record. In many places, lakes and rivers remained frozen until June. After a promisingly warm midsummer, freezing temperatures in early September ravaged crops. As a result, the harvest was about half of the average. By the autumn of 1867, people were dying by the thousands. The next famine is the Dutch famine of 1944-45, which is known in the Netherlands as the Honger Winter, which is meaning hunger winter, which was a famine that took place in the German-occupied Netherlands, especially in densely populated western provinces north of the great rivers during the winter of 1944-45, near the end of World War II. A German blockade cut off food and fuel shipments from farm towns. Some 4.5 million were affected and survived thanks to soup kitchens. Lode Jong, which was the author of The Kingdom of the Netherlands during World War II, estimated at least 22,000 deaths occurred due to the famine. Another author estimated 18,000 deaths from the famine. Most of the victims were reportedly elderly men. The famine was alleviated by the liberation of the provinces by the Allies in May 1945. Prior to that, bread baked from flour shipped in from Sweden, and the airlift of food by the Royal Air Force, the Royal Canadian Air Force, and the United States Army Air Forces under an agreement with the Germans that if the Germans didn't shoot at the Mercy flights, the Allies would not bomb the German positions, which helped to mitigate the famine. These were Operations Manna and Chauhand. Operation Faust also trucked in food to the province. Next, the Great Famine of Estonia, which killed about a fifth of Estonian and Livonian population, which is ranging from 70,000 to 75,000 people in 2 years. The climate was unfavorable for crops in 1694, and the summer of 1695 was cold and rainy followed by an early autumn frost that destroyed the summer crops. Cold conditions continued during 1696 and rain fell throughout the summer. Peasants, orphans, and the elderly began to die en masse of starvation, and the spring snow melt of 1697 revealed many corpses. Meanwhile, landlords and merchants exported grains to Finland and Sweden, where crops also had failed. About a fifth of Estonian population, 70,000 to 75,000 people died during the famine in Swedish Estonia, which didn't end until 1698. The Tenpo famine. This is also known as the Great Tenpo famine, which was a famine affected Japan during the Edo period. It is considered to have begun in 1833 and lasted until 1837. It was named after the Tenpo era during the reign of Emperor Ninko. The ruling shogun during the famine was Tokugawa Ieyasu. The famine was most severe in northern Honshu and was caused by flooding and cold weather. The famine was one of a series of calamities that shook the faith of the people in the ruling Bakufu. During the same period as the famine, there was also the Kogo fire of Edo. After that, 7.6 magnitude earthquake in Senriku region in 1835. In 1837, the last year of the famine, Osio Helkiaro led a revolt in Osaka against corrupt officials who refused to help feed the impoverished residents of the city. Another revolt sprang up in Chosu domain. Also in 1837, the American merchant vessel Morrison appeared off the coast of Shikoku and was driven away by the coastal artillery. The sum of these incidents made the Tokugawa Bakufu look weak and powerless and exposed the corruption of officials who profited while commoners suffered. Now, Sahel drought. The Sahel has long experienced a series of historic droughts dating back to at least the 17th century. Sahel region is a climate zone sandwiched between Sudanian savanna and to the Sahara deserts to the north, across West and Central Africa. While the frequency of drought in the region is thought to have increased from the end of 19th century, three long droughts have had dramatic environmental and societal effects upon the Sahel nations. Famines followed severe droughts in the 1910, 1940s and 1960s, 1970s, 1980s. Although a partial recovery occurred from 1975 to 80, the most recent drought occurred in 2012. The droughts are becoming increasingly more common, worse and more threatening due to global warming. A possible explanation to the hereditary trend is the supplements of an oceanography phenomenon called El Nino. An idea is that evaporation is occurring at higher rate due to the change in sea surface temperature. This then impacts the amount of rain the Sahel region receives. Another factor to keep into consideration is the response of our atmosphere to stimulants like greenhouse gases and carbon emissions. Next, the Vietnamese famine of 1945, which was a famine that occurred in northern Vietnam in French Indochina during World War II from October 1944 to late 1945, which at the time was under Japanese occupation from 1940 with Vichy France as a puppet government. Between 4 lakh to 2 million people are estimated to have starved to death during this time. The demographics vary from French estimates of 6 lakh to 7 lakh dead to official Vietnamese number of 10 lakh to 20 lakh victims. According to a 2018 study, the primary cause of the famine were typhoons that reduced the availability of food, Japan's occupation, American attacks on the Vietnamese transport system, and French colonial administration hindered an effective famine alleviation response. Now the famine in Somalia. In 2011, Somalia suffered a famine that killed 260,000 people in south and central regions. The famine was declared in July, but most people had already died by May. Years of drought that have also affected Kenya and Ethiopia have hit harvest, and conflict has made it extremely difficult for agencies to operate and assess communities in the south of the country. United Nations declared Somalia famine over in February 2012 following an exceptional harvest after good rains and food deliveries by aid agencies. Now, famine in Ethiopia. The Marxist policies of Mengistu Haile Mariam, which he began abandoning in 1990 with some economic reforms, left a country ravaged by economic decline, famine, and regional conflicts that consumed half of the state budget. In 1984-85, in the famine, up to 1 million Ethiopians starved to death. For months in 1984, Mengistu denied the devastating famine in Ethiopia's north. Aid workers later recalled he flew in planes loaded with whiskey to celebrate the anniversary of his revolution as hunger deepened. Bob Geldof, after watching pictures of the famine, organized Live Aid in 1985 to try to alleviate the hunger. Watched by 1.5 billion people, it raised $100 million for Africa starving. Next famine, the Great Chinese Famine, which was for 3 years of famine. It was a period in the history of the People's Republics of China which was characterized by widespread famine between the years 1959 to 1961. The Great Chinese Famine is widely regarded as the deadliest famine and one of the greatest man-made disasters in human history, with an estimated death toll due to starvation that ranges in the tens of millions. The major contributing factors in the famines were the policies of the Great Leap Forward and people communes, in addition to some natural disasters such as drought which took place during the period. During the 7,000 Cards conferences in early 1962, Liu Shaoqi, the second chairman of Public Republic of China, formally attributed the famine 30% to natural disasters and 70% to man-made errors. After the launch of reforms and opening up, the Communist Party of China officially stated in June 1981 that the famine was mainly due to the mistakes of Great Leap Forward as well as anti-rightist campaign, in addition to some natural disasters and the Sino-Soviet split. Now, famine in Cambodia. Up to 2 million people died of famine following a decade of conflict, first during the 1970 and 75 Civil War, then during the brutal Khmer Rouge era until 1978, and finally in the aftermath of the Vietnamese invasion that ended Khmer Rouge rule in 1979. So this presentation was all about great famines of the world. Now my presentation ends here. Thank you very much. I have given here my YouTube channel details, Journey with Vijay Kumar Shrivastav. Having request, please visit the channel, subscribe it, and provide your kind and valuable feedback for further improvements. Thank you.